Hello, and welcome to another video. Lately, I've been experimenting a lot with watercolor effects in Procreate, and I want to share some tips and tricks I've learned for getting more texture in your painting. Most of what I'm going to show you was done using just the default brushes and tools. I'm going to be showing you how to create organic-looking blooms or watermarks, how to get interesting patterns that mimic the salt effect, and how to create splatter without using a custom stamp brush. I thought I'd demonstrate these techniques using this example piece. So on the left here I have a scan of a traditional watercolor sketch, and on the right is a copy I made using digital brushes and techniques. As you can see, I got pretty close, so I'm going to talk a bit about how I built up the texture in this painting and created the special effects. First, I'm going to talk about the brush I used for most of this painting. I used a modified version of the water bleed brush that you can find in the water section of the brush library. This is what the brush looks like by default. You'll see it kind of has a smeared look to it. One of the main changes I made was to increase the texture of the brush by opening it up in Brush Studio, then going to Grain. This brush has a wet paper texture applied to it already. This is a default texture that's part of Procreate's source library. I left the texture file as is, but I changed the grain behavior from moving to texturized. Moving essentially takes this image and it kind of drags it through your stroke, and that's why it ends up looking smeared. Texturized, on the other hand, stamps the grain behind your stroke so that you end up with a more prominent grain. I also adjusted the scale to make the grain a little bit finer, and adjusted the depth, which controls how strong the grain appears. I changed a couple of other settings as well, but you can see that just by changing grain behavior, it makes a huge difference already, and you get a lot more visible grain inside of the brush stroke. You can use a noise overlay to create additional texture across your whole painting. In traditional watercolors, not only does the paper have texture, the paint itself has texture. So you can think of the noise acting as particles of pigment. You can create a noise layer easily by just filling a layer with black, then going to Adjustments, Noise, and then you just kind of slide your pencil to the right to increase the amount of noise. You can scale it up a bit. And then I usually go to Gaussian blur and just add like maybe 2% blur, so it's not quite so sharp. Alright, now I'm going to go back to my layers and change to the blend mode to overlay. Here's what it looks like with the added noise. You can refine it a bit by adding a layer mask and painting out areas where you don't want so much graininess, like the skin and the hair. You can also adjust the opacity so it's not quite so strong, but yeah, that's how you would add a noise layer. Alternatively, you can also scan a piece of watercolor paper and import that, and use it as a texture overlay. Alright, so now we're getting to the fun part, special effects. I'm going to talk about 3 common types of effects that are used in traditional watercolors to create texture: blooms, salt, and splatter. So we're going to start with blooms. What are blooms? Blooms, also called blossoms, backruns, cauliflowers, happen when water dries unevenly. You can easily create one by just dropping some diluted paint or pure water onto an area that's already begun to dry. Capillary action causes the water to spread outwards, pushing the paint along and leaving this characteristic dark, ragged edge. Blooms have a bit of a bad rap because they often happen unintentionally, but they can be used very purposefully to create flower blossoms, stands of trees, clouds, or just abstract patterns. The most common way to create blooms digitally is to use a stamp brush, which is essentially just a scan of an actual painted bloom. If I go to my watercolor brushes, you can see there are some stamps in here already. While the stamp looks very realistic, the downside is that you're limited to just one or a few unique shapes depending on how many stamps you make. I'm going to show you a method where you actually paint the bloom. I like this method better because you can really shape the bloom more easily and you get a different result every time, like when you use real watercolors. To do this, we're going to use one of the artistic brushes. We're going to select this Wild Light brush. Now at first glance, it doesn't look like anything special, but you'll notice that unlike most other brushes, it's got darkened edges and a lighter center. And that's essentially what a bloom is. It's a darkened ring with a lighter interior. So if we peek under the hood, you'll see that this is actually a dual brush. It's two brushes, and the second brush is being subtracted from the first brush, and that's what gives it that lighter center. Now, if we take a look at the second brush, if we look at the grain, it's got this paper grain, and we want something a bit more organic, so we're going to open this up and edit it. We're going to go to the source library and look for an image that's a bit more craggly. There's a few textures that would work pretty well. I'm actually going to select this zombie brush. It does have this interesting crackly texture that I think will work well. So I'm going to hit done and see what that looks like. So I'm going to try and add a bloom right here within this shape. You'll notice that as I move my pencil back and forth over the same area, it's getting lighter due to that subtract blend mode, but I can keep the edges dark and sort of push them out to make it resemble a bloom. As you can see, you can get some really interesting effects with this brush, and I like the fact that every time you do it, you get something slightly different. Then I can adjust the blend mode to make it look more natural. I'm also dialing down the opacity a bit so it's less prominent. I really like this technique because there's an element of unpredictability. It feels a lot like watercolors where you just never quite know what you're gonna get. So this is where things get a little crazy because I started thinking, what other textures might work better with this brush and give me more of that kind of crenulated edge that real blooms have? What about using cauliflower? Blooms are often compared to cauliflower, so in a moment of genius/insanity, I thought maybe using a photo of actual cauliflower was the answer. So I grabbed an image from the internet and opened it onto a new square canvas. Then I copied the canvas and pasted it into the brush grain source, just as an experiment. And you know what? It actually looks kind of cool. Then I started thinking, what's like cauliflower but not cauliflower? And the answer, of course, was Romanesco. Romanesco has a weird fractal pattern, so I wasn't sure if this was gonna work, but sometimes you just have to follow where inspiration leads. And you know what? That turned out pretty cool too. I really encourage you to experiment and try different wacky ideas. You might not end up with something that looks exactly like what you were trying to replicate, but you might stumble onto something unique and interesting in its own right, something that can't be done in traditional media. Next, we're going to look at salt effects. Salt acts as a kind of resist on watercolors, leaving behind pale, starburst shapes. The results are going to vary a lot depending on the type of salt used, the wetness of the paper, the type of paper, and even the kind of pigment. These effects are a way to create visual interest and to suggest different materials and surfaces. Alright, let's say I want to add some salt texture into this sand area. So the first thing I'm going to do is make sure I'm on a separate layer. because we're going to be applying some effects to this. Then I'm going to go into my brushes and choose one of these water flick type brushes. And then I just lay in some random dots. And I can kind of scale it a bit. Next, I'm going to go to Adjustments and then Liquify. And you'll notice there's a couple of different Liquify options. The one I'm going to use is this crystals one because that's essentially what salt is. I'm going to zoom in even a bit further so you can see what's happening. All I do is press down on these dots, and you'll see as I do this, it sort of distorts the dots and explodes them into these shapes that sort of resemble salt crystals. It's actually really fun. Then once you're happy with it, you can go back to your layers and change the blend mode so the salt is lighter in color and looks like it's being subtracted from the base color. I often use screen. You can also go for a stronger effect by using divide and then tone down the opacity a bit. Now I'm going to show you a second simpler method I discovered for adding salt texture. I'm going to hide this and create a new layer. I'm going to open up my brushes again, go to my artistic brushes, and this time I'm going to choose this Aurora brush. And I'm going to make one small tweak to it. I want it to be spaced a little bit further apart so I get these individual shapes. Then I'm going to hit done. And now I just draw in some of these little flecks. And then again, kind of play around with blend modes. I like to go pretty strong and then tone it back as needed. The end result is a bit more abstract. It may not look exactly like salt crystals, but it does serve the purpose of creating some interesting modeling and texture. And last but not least, we're going to talk about splatter effects. Splatter or spatter can be created in a number of ways. You can tap a brush to get small round droplets, or flick to get more elongated directional drops. A brush with harder bristles will give you more of a fine mist, and a large brush or dropper will give you big splashes. Splatter effects are often used in watercolors to give the impression of sandy beaches or ocean spray, or just to add some liveliness to a painting. So Procreate has some default splatter stamp brushes that work pretty well. Since splatter is usually pretty small in scale, it's harder to tell when it's being repeated. I use the Flicks brush under spray paint for the splatter effects you see here. I want to show you some more unconventional methods of creating splatter. Let's say I want to add some paint splotches in here. I'm going to go into my brushes and then go to Vintage. And this is going to seem pretty nutty. We're going to use this bolt brush, which at first glance looks like one of those brushes that's just a gimmick that no one actually uses for anything. But I'm going to show you how, with just a few modifications, you can turn this into something pretty interesting. So the first thing we're going to do is go to spacing and just turn that all the way down to about 5%. And you can see right away it starts to make the brush kind of fuzzy looking. Then I'm going to go to grain and change it into something that isn't so streaky. I'm going to go to the source library and I'm going to just choose the wet paper texture that I used on my main brush. And I'm also going to adjust the depth of that. This brush has a lot of color dynamics on it, so we're just going to turn most of that off. Alright. So I'm going to draw some blotches up in this area. I'm moving my pencil in a circle to create the blotch, and I get this nice irregular edge that, when you zoom out, looks like the scalloped edge of a paint splotch. And then I can play around with different blend modes to integrate it better. And it kind of even works in reverse, like if you wanted to use it as a negative shape, that works too. I'm gonna set it to hard light and lower the opacity a little bit. I have some color variation in here that also helps to make it look more natural. So that's how you can add some splotches to your painting without relying on a stamp brush. Lastly, I'm going to show you how to create some linear flicks. Let's say I want to make it look like the emu is kicking up some sand or something like that. This one does involve quite a few steps, just to warn you. First, I'm going to go to my brushes and just pick an inking or drawing brush. Any old brush will do here. And I'm just going to go in here and draw some lines and dots like this. Roughly how I want my flicks to look. Then I'm going to go to Adjustments and then Halftone. I'm going to choose the screen print option, and when I slide my pencil to the right, it turns my marks into dots. So that's step one, just generating some dots to work with, and then step two is manipulating those dots. Before we do that, I'm just going to alpha lock it and change the color to brown. Okay, so now I have these random dots, but they don't have any directionality to them yet. So I'm going to use adjustments to stretch them out a bit. Because I applied a halftone, the layer is currently taking up the whole canvas. So I'm going to cut this part out and paste it back in. And now I can more easily warp it to get kind of that spray effect. If there are too many dots, you can always remove some of it. Alright, so now I'm pretty close to something that looks like a linear flick. The last thing I'm going to do is to go to Liquify and just kind of mess them up a little bit so they don't look like perfect ellipses. And there you have it, a linear flick that was made using halftone. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned some creative ways to add texture and special effects to your digital watercolors. If anything, I hope this encourages you to just play around more in Brush Studio. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!